Howdy folks, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am your host, The Mighty Bjorn, and today for you folks, I have a new Robotech role-playing game video. Going to be taking some time today and discussing an idea I'd put together for a campaign. Essentially, it was a campaign that was set after the Macross saga, if you will, but before Return of the Masters or the Southern Cross, if you will. And this essentially was inspired by the Zentradi breakout and the idea of mercenary pilots, or essentially my players was going to play as mercenary pilots after the Macross saga. And I'm kind of taking some inspiration from Jack Archer himself, as during the the global civil war, he was a mercenary pilot. So there's a little bit of real world influence and a little bit of fictional universe influence with the idea of doing a mercenary pilots campaign. But I think the best thing to do is kind of set the stage of what things was like after the Macross saga, especially within the first several years of the Macross saga. So we got to set the stage first, and essentially what it comes down to is the Earth was ravaged by Chiron's reign of death, and certain areas of Earth was basically nothing more than a wasteland. And I'm not talking about the cool kind of wasteland with Liberty Prime. Now, when it comes to the Zentradi themselves, some would actually end up joining the RDF, later the REF. Some would go on to try to lead normal lives, and others would essentially stay militaristic and kind of hide on Earth or wherever else they could. There's even an adventure module where there's a Zentradi ship still hanging out in space, essentially orbiting the moon. And then some of these Zentradi would be micronized, some of them wouldn't, and that would even include the rebels, as some of the rebels would actually leave the Zentradi to join the RDF, become micronized, and essentially would just kind of return to the warlike ways that the Zentradi are. Now, when it comes to the world on a global stage, essentially, even though the global Earth government is still around, essentially things have become divided. There's a lot of political tensions and conflicts all over the world. Russia's completely backed out of things, forming EPSIS, and there's essentially a lot of conflicts going on, fighting over the last bit of resources that is available at the time frame. With all that being said, there's also a lot of restructuring and changes going on within the RDF itself, such as the retirement of the VF-1A was a big thing, with more VF-1Rs being built. And thus, that's where my players come into play. Because of the retirement of the VF-1A, some pilots, well, not because of the retirement of the VF-1A, but the VF-1A is getting retired, and some pilots within the RDF essentially are leaving the RDF. They've had enough of war, so on and so forth. And this is where my players come into play. Veterans of the first Robotech War. Essentially, they decide to leave the RDF, become mercenaries. They got a financial backer, and essentially they're able to scarf up some VF-1As from either the batch of retirement planes and even spare parts and planes from aircraft boneyards themselves. And it kind of turns into how many scrap planes can we take to make one good Veritech. And then essentially they set out to become mercenary pilots, much like the Flying Tigers of old. Now, the campaign itself would be set within South America, and that's because that's essentially where Zentradi Breakout is set, or at least that campaign source book, if you will. And then essentially their first contract would essentially be nothing more than essentially advisors and training pilots for a force within South America. So some other parts of the world would actually get their hands on Veritechs, mostly VF1As, some of them being old models, pretty much used and abused, and essentially scrapped together models. And South America actually did have, if you look in the source book, has some factions that actually does have Veritechs, which is who they would be contracted to. Now, the idea is they would actually receive a 15% increase in pay, which sounds good and all, but essentially it comes down to, well, they got food, bills, apartment, cars, etc. All that's kind of stuff that they weren't paying for before when they were part of the RDF, and now they are. Now, when it comes to the use of an airfield, essentially, they're the company or the group, the faction that they're contracted to, will supply the airfield. It also, as part of the contract, they will be supplied spare parts and maintenance, as well as munitions. And this is where Zentradi Rebels comes into play, because within South America, there's a lot of Zentradi rebels that are essentially hiding in the jungles. And essentially the idea of Zentradi Breakout is well, their Agent Orange got all jacked up and they're deciding to pick a fight. Thus, a new contract would be set up, another increase in pay for the pilots, because now they go from being training pilots and advisors to actually being frontline fighters fighting the Zentradi rebels. And that's basically where the cultural exchange of warfare once again begins. Now, in my mind, when it comes to my players, in general terms, they're going to be equipped with VF1Rs, although I had the thoughts of maybe throwing a VF1D in there as like a modified two-seat model, if you will. It is a two-seat model, but it's meant for training. I thought about maybe trying to use one as kind of a modified model along the lines of, think of like an F-14 Tomcat, where essentially the pilot's focused on the fighting while the other crewman, the Rio, is essentially the weapons officers. Actually, I think it's Wizzo for a F-14 Tomcat, which would be weapons specialist officer. As well as maybe I would throw my players a VF-1J. Don't know, never really did this campaign, but it would, as I said, I'm sharing concepts and ideas with you. Now, the Zentradi itself, basically a lot of their equipment is going to be scrapped together equipment that they used during the first Robotech War, which also kind of gives the players a little bit of advantage because the players themselves are veterans of the first Robotech War. So they have an idea of what the combat capabilities of the Zentradi stuff is. With that being said, though, the Zentradi also has a lot of heavily modified stuff, which also throws the players off a little bit. Other than that, the Zentradi are really not well equipped. A lot of their equipment is pretty much ramshackled together, but they're still a threat, mostly because they're hungry. Now, with all that being said, a lot of this is using artistic license. All this is really based off the Palladium Books version of Robotech, but essentially, the nice thing is it's an RPG, so using some artistic license to make a campaign that your players may find interesting is a good thing. Also, with that being said, this campaign is, I feel, a good way to set up the introduction of Epsis to the players themselves, as essentially Epsis kind of, becomes more active after the first Robotech War, and not everybody really knows a lot about them. Now, when it comes to the missions itself, well, essentially I'm going to let the missions up to your interpretation if you kind of want to just take this concept and use it for your Robotech campaign. Because essentially you're going to want to know, what kind of missions you're going to want to put on. You're going to know what your players are going to enjoy. So I think that's really the best way to go. For me, a lot of it was going to be like a lot of reconnaissance and strike missions, maybe a few defensive missions, etc. basically the very basic stuff that you would use in a Robotech campaign. But anyway, folks, there's just some little snippets of a campaign that I was going to put together for Robotech. Hopefully you all find this video enjoyable and that maybe you can use this as inspiration for your own Robotech campaign. Anyway, folks, thanks again for tuning in and have yourselves a wonderful day.